Hello, everybody. I'm Teju Abiola, and I'm here with Winsor Newton Watercolors today to talk to you about our designer's gouache. A little bit about me. I studied illustration in school, and I've been working as an illustrator for the past 6 years. And I've been trained in a lot of different mediums, but watercolor is my absolute favorite. And gouache is under that umbrella. So let's just get in today. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Jessica and Lauren will be very helpful in sharing those with me as we go. All right. Okay, so to start, Lauren already shared, but here's the Plaza Instagram hashtag to check out what else they've got going on. And then the Winsor Newton handle where you can see a lot of interesting things and learn more about our products. And if you want to see a little bit more of my work or know some more about me, that's mine. And then would love to see what you create today, and you could share it with the Create with Plaza Art hashtag. All right. So to start, I'm going to just do a quick setup of my palette and like kind of walk through the colors we're using today. So we are using the Winsor and Newton Designer's Gouache primary color palette. And if you don't know what a primary color is, it's just a color that you technically can't mix yourself, but you can mix all the other colors with and make a nice gamut or range. Oops. And so the typical primaries are yellow, red, or like a magenta, and then blue. And this kit also has a green, a black, and white, because those also help you get an interesting range. And then the green will be helpful today in like the leaves we're painting. One thing I like about gouache is you can be kind of generous when you kind of lay out your palette. And there's lots of different ways that you can choose to do that. It is, gouache is simply opaque watercolor. That's all that it is. It has the same binder. It has the same pigments. They're just kind of prepped a little bit differently so that there's kind of a higher ratio of pigment to binder, which is what makes it opaque versus your typical transparent watercolors. Okay, so let me show you real quick what those are. So this is an example of ultramarine blue pigment, but lots of pigments are kind of mulled into this fine dusty powder, and then they're mixed with gum arabic, which you can also mix into your medium to hold it all together. And then this is what gum arabic looks like before they like dilute it in water. It comes from, I believe, like a acacia tree. And it's just the tree gum. All right. Are there any questions so far?
Okay. Did ask what the green you are using is.
Oh, yes. The green I'm using is permanent green middle, and it's included in this kit because it's like a good mid-tone green.
In the primary color set of the designer's gouache.
Yes, good mid-tone green. Yeah, so it's pretty, it's not like too warm or too cool. It's just nice right in the middle. And then the other colors I'm using are primary red, primary yellow, primary blue, and then ivory black and zinc white. Zinc white is also known as Chinese white. You might also be familiar with titanium white. Chinese white or zinc white, it's a little bit better for mixing because it doesn't overpower your mixes as much. and you can get some like more smooth blends that way. And ivory black is kind of the same. It does kind of have a slight brownish tint. So that kind of can help sometimes with not like removing all the color from your mixes. So I mentioned a little bit that gouache is just opaque watercolor. But some of the pigments and colors are not fully opaque, even if they are more opaque than what you might find in a traditional watercolor. A good example of that is primary red, which is, and you can see it on the tube, this little square has the little half filled symbol, that means semi-opaque. And then the zinc white, for example, has the opaque, but it will still be more opaque than if it was a traditional watercolor.
Just a real quick question while you're swatching out. If we don't have, from Carol, if we don't have all the colors, can we just use watercolors or mix them with white gouache?
You can mix them with white gouache, and it'll make them more opaque. It might make the color, it'll make the color lighter too, because when a color is at its full strength, that's called the mass tone. Let me switch my camera for a second. When a color is at its full strength, like straight out the tube, or like swatched without diluting it or mixing it with anything, that's its mass tone. And as you can see, like that is pretty vibrant. If you mix that with white, even if it was a watercolor, it'll it'll get lighter because white is still a pigment. It's not like clear. You can mix watercolor with white gouache and it'll be fine. It'll just adjust the color a little bit, and if that's totally fine. So yes, to answer the question, of course you can. And you can use both gouache and watercolor at the same time. It's actually not mixed media unless you are just trying to use like transparent watercolors. Yes, I hope that answered your question. All right. I'm gonna do ivory black.
We use acrylic.
Can you mix it with acrylic? So acrylic's binder is actually, sorry. Acrylic's binder is actually acrylic, which is a polymer. It's plastic. So you can't mix them together while you're like painting because their binder is different. It's not really gonna work together. You could use like gouache on top of acrylic because acrylic you can't re-wet it. Once it dries, it actually cures. Like the plastic will cure and it's solid. That's why acrylic becomes waterproof. But gouache and watercolor, if you've used either of them, once you get enough layers, you can still reconstitute it, which is also one thing I really love about gouache is you can get like that opaque look that you can kind of get with acrylics and layer. But I actually do like being able to modify and adjust. So if you used acrylic underneath and painted gouache on top, or if you painted with gouache, you could use acrylic on top, but you'd have to be pretty careful and it could get messy. So I'd advise the other way around. Okay. All right. So I'm swatching these so I can also show you like mixing them with white, because today we're painting florals and we will absolutely get to it. But a lot of times when people use gouache, they are like, oh, it's opaque. So they only use it opaquely when you can use it a lot of different ways. And diluting it with water does a little bit something different aside from like making it thinner than like mixing it with white or mixing it with other gouache and painting at a certain strength. So like mixing with white for the green, like there's this, it's a very solid color, but you could also just dilute it. Like if you were just using watercolor, you'd be like, oh, I'm not going to use white. I'll just dilute it to get the light green I want. But it kind of has a different feeling to it there. And then same with the gray. Just do that. Okay. All right, for that. One thing I do want to show before we get into the florals is gouache versus watercolor. So we're using the primary blue, which is the same pigment as Winsor blue green shade, Winsor blue red shade too, but green shade is the warmer version, which is PB15. Oh my goodness. So you're gonna see here that these have the same pigment, same binder, but they're a little different. And you can already see just in the palette that they look totally different, even though it's gum arabic and the same pigment in there. It's because this has been milled to be more opaque. So you're just kind of seeing the pigment full force. Gum arabic is transparent things, light goes through it. So it kind of makes everything look darker right off the bat. So I'm going to swatch this for you. This is the watercolor. The mass tone is pretty dark. And then I'm going to add some water. And you can get it lighter. And you can get a really wide range here. And you can do that with a lot of different gouache. Not all gouache is going to be just like this, but this gouache is. But you can already see this is more opaque right off the bat. And then its value is lighter. And you can and it's also flat and kind of even. I'm using a lot of water because I just like to, but it's a little cloudier per se. But if you wanted to get this smooth color, you'd have to really pre-mix the watercolor you want. So that's also one difference. And then when this dries, I'll also show layering as to like how that's a little bit different with the gouache. All right. And now I'm going to start painting some of this. Okay. Any other questions? I feel like I went through a lot right there. Everybody still with me? Oh, let me talk about why Laura mentioned I use like 2 cups of water. One is for dirty water and one is for clean water, because gouache especially, it's so pigmented, it'll dirty your water really fast and it'll affect your mixes. Like if you feel like you're getting muddy over time, it might be because the colors that you're trying to get rid of is in your water that you're using to paint. So I usually use one to clean my brush off, and I'll sometimes wipe it, and then I'll go into clean water, and I try to keep that as clean as possible the whole time and be able to get my clean colors. I'm going to wipe this, and then we're going to start painting. Are there any other questions for me? Oh.
Yes, there is one. Is Winsor Newton blue-green shade like phthalo blue-green shade?
Yep. Yeah, it's PB15, phthalocyanine. That's the pigment. Winsor blue is just what we call it. So I'm going to start, actually, first thing I'm going to do is kind of look at the reference. We're kind of going to break down what we're going to do. I have found a lot of people when they're talking about watercolor or gouache. They're like, it's a little unruly. I don't know what's going on. I made a mistake, what have you. Watercolor kind of favors if you're a little bit prepared and you think ahead. So looking at the reference, I believe these are clubbed begonias. What I like about them is I like their shape, I like their color, I like how it blends in. There's a lot of, they're clustered together, but when I translate it over here, I'm not actually going to use this composition specifically. We're doing expressive florals today. And such as when I painted this, I had a few different flowers and it did not look like this. I just took like 4 different flowers and then I just like made a bunch of stuff up. Because the good thing about flowers is everyone kind of knows what they look like. They're like petals, and then you have little bits and bobs. You don't need to know everything. You just kind of know the general shape and you know what they kind of look like. So everybody's painting can look totally different. You don't have to do exactly what I do, but I'm just gonna look, I'm like, what I know I'm gonna need to do is mix like a middle pink ahead of time. Mixing your colors before is also a really good thing to do so you don't get lost later. And I like to mix, you can use gouache straight out of the tube. You can also use it like watercolor after it dries if you want kind of a little different consistency. But I'm adding some water in. I'm cleaning my brush after I mix it a little bit because I want to add more water, but I don't want to mess up the clean water. So I'm just kind of making a big puddle of red because this is probably going to be the biggest color we use. Now the consistency here is kind of like a thin, it's like a thick milk or a thin yogurt, which is probably, it's kind of like the middle texture for gouache that I think is kind of the best. But you can go thicker and you can go thinner. And that's what is really advantageous about gouache over watercolor is you can paint over things. So I'm not just gonna take the paint and then put it right on the paper. Also, like moving it around on your palette will help like even out the distribution of pigment and make your, oops, I've already contaminated my water. It'll make your washes more even when you go. So you're like, why did I mix out white when I could just paint on the paper? As I talked about before, mixing it with white is going to do a little bit of something different than just straight up water. I also like to paint, okay, I'm going to make my first mark. And it might be hard to see because it's white, but I'm going to be making a shape of like the flower. The silhouette of these is kind of what I'm starting out when I am going to be laying out kind of my composition here. And then I'm going to add in the red later. I'm just going to show you one so you can get started. I'm not really looking at a single flower. I'm like looking at all of them. And let me, so you can kind of see where I'm going. I'm blending into the shape that I made. Kind of looking at overall, I think the center will be kind of here. Centers often are darker. I know that they're lighter in here, but I like this red, so I want to use it. You don't have to be super perfect with it. Right.
Do you have tips for how you keep your palette paints from drying out?
Yes, absolutely. So if you're worried about that, this is a tip I learned in school, actually. I don't always use it because sometimes I don't really mind re-wetting my paint. Like I'll use a spray bottle, and if I see it kind of drying out, I'll just do a little spray, spray, spray. I do that to prep my watercolor paint if I haven't painted in a long time. I have to be prepared for a very crusty palette. This is another gouache palette I have. I'll spray this, and these are all dried up and they'll re-wet. One thing though, because gouache is higher pigment thing, it'll crack. I don't know if any of you have put gouache into a palette and then you go away for a little bit and it just like falls out. It's because it's just so highly pigmented with such little gum arabic in it. But if you paint frequently, it'll kind of hold it in. That can also happen on your palette. On your paper, if you paint too thickly, it'll crack a little bit too. So spraying, but also the tip that I learned in school, I believe they'll take a paper towel, they'll kind of roll it up. I don't know if you've heard of a stay wet palette. It's basically that. You just get a little wet thing, you put that in your palette, and then you squeeze your paints on that, and it'll keep it wet longer. If you're really worried about them drying out, I usually just add a little bit of water, or I just squeeze as much paint as I think I'm gonna need. Hope that answered your question. All right.
A great tip, thank you.
And then I have, like, I could still probably paint, this is a really old one. I could paint off of this if I wanted to, and re-wet it, but it's kind of just a dud. But this is kind of how I would lay it out. I like to lay my colors like light to dark. All right, so this actually has started to dry, which this will depend on where you live, how quickly things dry and stay wet, and that's like one of the most important things about watercolor is water control, and like your humidity will affect it. Okay, so as you can see here, I put some white in, and now I'm kind of blending into the white, and you can't see the white necessarily, but it is kind of flowing and blending. I'm using the white to kind of make a shape. Come on, there you go. So I kind of try to keep things wet and flowing as much as possible for this first, what I call like my first layer. And I try to get a lot in as much as I can. This is kind of an example that I started. This is all kind of layer one. There's lots of different ways of painting with gouache. And I started with watercolor before I used gouache. The way I was taught in school was kind of a very illustration designer kind of way, where it was like very flat washes, very perfect, very like old age illustration, which is not what I like most about watercolor. I like that there's a lot of stuff you can do. So I put a base layer in while it's still wet. I want some of these bleeds. So I'm like putting in hits of paint. I kind of want a little bit of this. I like a little bit of the yellow. Here I kind of went more blue, more purple. How do you get those? Just mix them. So I kind of like, I did talk about mixing stuff ahead of time. If you want to use a lot of a color, I do kind of like to mix as I go sometimes and see what happens. But since I had already done this, I kind of knew what I wanted to do. But I advise mixing a lot if you want to use a lot of that. All right. Okay, so this edge is still wet. You can see by the shine. And I'm going to kind of use wet. My water is kind of dirty, but it's not so, it's kind of a neutral color, which can actually be kind of useful even with florals. We all like the very bright, vibrant colors, but neutrals can be nice as well, because it's like, this isn't white, but it's white, if you know what I mean. Right. Okay. Any other questions? So for shape, I'm like looking at the reference, but I'm also just looking at the paper, kind of seeing how I want things to go in. Right now, I'm pretty diluted because this is just layer one. I'm going to go over this. The thicker you go, the harder it is to paint over later. And I want to give myself time and flexibility to adjust. Okay. Some more white. Okay. Composition wise, some of the petals I'm not attaching. Why? Just because I feel like it. You can do things because they look good as a picture. We're painting from a picture, but we're not painting the picture. We're making our own picture, which I also feel like takes a lot of pressure off for me, because I do like to kind of draw out my compositions beforehand a lot of the time, but I'm trying to be a little bit more spontaneous, really let the paint do things that I think are fun. All right. Okay. I like to show my palette so you can kind of see how I'm mixing stuff. If you're the type of person who wants to keep things separate, maybe a butcher's tray isn't what you like the most. Maybe you keep your mixes more separate. There's a lot of different ways to paint with watercolor. This is just one of them. This is kind of how my mind thinks. I like all the colors kind of blending in together. There's no blue here. I just like blue, so I'm using blue. I'm still kind of looking at this. These petals overlap and some of these don't. I might come in and add some stuff later. That's what I like, again, about this lighter first little bit here. And on my page, I'm kind of keeping everything the same, like thickness, density, whatever the word is. There. All right. Okay. I'm gonna make some purple, make it dark. So I have not used any black yet. And sometimes people might say not to use black because it'll like take the color out of your paintings. But black is kind of like white in that white just makes things lighter, black just makes things darker. You use these to add color in. If I really wanted a really dark thing, we're not quite there yet, I'll use black sometimes because this blue won't get any darker. If I want a darker blue that doesn't have like the red in it, then I'll add in the black there. Okay. So, got a little yellow in there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to do some of these, and these are not in here. I just really like these when I'm kind of doing a floral spread to fill in areas, fill in spaces. I like how the color can blend together, kind of evoking, I don't know, like a hydrangea or a baby's breath or something. Okay. let me know if you have any questions or need any clarification. Or if you let me know how new you are to gouache if you are new, or if you use gouache in a different way. That would be fun to know as well.
Are there certain surfaces that you like to use other than watercolor papers?
I just love watercolor, so I use watercolor paper the most. I have a sketch here. This is not watercolor paper. This is just a tinted paper, which is also nice with gouache for, oh, see, this stuff is much thicker than what I'm doing here because I'm like building up. It's very opaque. So this is some kind of brown craft paper thing. These are some sketches. So this is fun. I personally just like using watercolor paper the most. You can use gouache is nice because you can use it on a lot of different things. You can use it on canvases. Back when illustration was mostly traditional in like the golden age, they would paint a lot with oils, but then when they had to like do edits or put type on, they would use gouache because you could just paint it right over. You can wipe it off if you have to do a different thing. And that's one of the reasons that this gouache is called designer's gouache. Popular with designers and illustrators. Also because it is flat when it dries, opaque. You can get really flat washes, really opaque washes. Let's see this thing. Oh no, I kind of messed this up. I think I put a paper over it. So this is not flat like it should be. Well, I'll just do it again. Took a big brush here. Flat wash. There we go. I will say I like using watercolor paper because it's absorbent, and you can really do a lot to it. Some surfaces are more, they're not as absorbent and stuff can sit on top, which is perfectly fine if that's what you want. But okay, so this is a good example. I don't think it was fully dry, but I put the yellow over the blue and it blended a little bit because gouache is still watercolor, but the yellow is more transparent than the blue, but it's still gouache, which is an interesting thing. But if I got much thicker with it, I could fully cover.
Amy is asking if did you say that you can use gouache over oil? Does the oil have to be dry first?
Yes, the oil has to be dry because water and oil don't mix. So the oil should be fully dry, fully cured before you do that. Yes. I do want to show a little bit the difference between gouache that is a little dried out, forgive the crustiness, and the gouache fresh out of the tube. One reason I do like drying my gouache out is I can kind of control the water amount a little bit more, which I like. This has to sit for a little bit, so we'll come back to that. All right. Let me paint faster so we get what we're done. All right. Just adding these in. Oh, it's quite dirty, but it's okay.
So, Pamela has a question of watercolor dries lighter than when applied. Is gouache the same?
Yes, yes. And in fact, sometimes gouache will dry much darker than you think as well. This was quite the bane of my existence in school. But yes, that'll happen. And the reason that happens is because water evaporates, and water is still a thing that interacts with light. Like if someone has lighter hair and they get their hair wet, it looks darker because the water is interacting with light in a certain way. Or if you get a shirt wet, it gets darker. It's the same exact thing. So yes, that'll happen. But the more you paint with the paint you have and mix the colors you have, the more you'll know what to expect. And then also a good rule of thumb is if you're a little apprehensive, just go a little more intense. See, I put a bit in there.
Do you yourself do a swatch book of colors for yourself?
Sometimes I did in the past. I've done quite a few. I don't know where they are now, but I don't always, I honestly want to do another one because sometimes I forget what I have, but it's like once you just paint enough, I kind of just remember what I'm using. And I don't, in a singular painting, it's not always the best to use a lot of colors, which is why this is also great because it's a limited thing. It'll give you more color harmony. But honestly, I should do more swatches. Thank you for that. I should do that. I have done in the past, I should say. So I wonder why I stopped. It can be good just to know what things are going to do. And that goes back to what I was saying about watercolor being like a planning medium for all its looseness. If you do your swatches, you'll be like, I know how this goes. What I actually find to be more useful than swatches is mixing. And you don't have to do like, the mixing chart, but it's like, how do I get the mixes that I want to get? How are certain colors or pigments going to interact with each other? Okay. I'm taking a while to fill this page. If you're faster than me, you can be much faster. I can be slow sometimes. So don't worry about how long it takes to do anything, or if you want to throw stuff down really quickly. It's all really about kind of how you're doing. And you could paint all of this like a completely flat shape, and it'll be fine. I love watercolor so much because of the diffusion, and I love optical mixing a lot as well. Okay. You can also tell that I really like blue. I kind of ignored the yellow in the reference because I like blue. I think one of the most important things to remember when you're painting anything is what you like. Okay. Now, I think this is good enough for me to start going over. I'm going to show you some things. Okay. So in this example, and before we get in, like I painted a washier thing here. I dropped in some color and then I went over it with these lines. Also here is an example of like going over dark with light. Like that was thinner, that was thicker. I like that you can get this like diversity of like finishes per se with gouache. Whereas if I painted this in watercolor, it would feel different, which is fine. Gouache has more body to it. Like this was rather opaque, which contrasts with these that I did for these roses because I wanted a different feeling. Like this is much more robust. But okay, so I'm going here. This is a pretty like mid-tone flat. One thing I can do with white is go over it. So I could have done, I just put my finger in that. Look at that. I could have left the middle lighter, or I'm going to add white on top, because like what I like in the photo is I like how the white is kind of super bright, and it is like coming forward. So with watercolor, often people will leave the white to the white of the paper. It's like very glowy and beautiful. Love it. But white also comes forward in space. So I want like this. I love how like in my face kind of that white is. So I'm gonna, even though it's kind of receding, I'm gonna go over this. And there's even lighter there. I'm going over this. All right. And I'm getting water to kind of dilute a little bit. I'm just using pure white right now because I want it to be very bright. And I'm going in the middle there, I think here. Doing that. Kind of blending that on a softer edge. All right. And then I want a thicker pink as well, because I think it just adds some depth. Like with the physical paint, not just the values and colors. Sometimes if I'm a little apprehensive about the color I just mixed, I'll do a little swatch on something. Okay. There we go. All right. I'm making a shadow here. All right. So my paint is going to get thicker, probably. You can also go over it just like watercolor in a thinner way, but I'm kind of going to get thicker here. How do I want to, where do I want to go here? Kind of making shadows. Blending it. Adding some here. Okay, do I want this to go over or do I want this to go over? I think I want this to go over. And I'm gonna make that a shadow. Okay, I think at this point, I want to add in some, so depending on how you like to paint, you might like fill the whole thing and establish your composition. I'm kind of intuitively feeling this right now. So I didn't do that because I also left some space because I want to do some leaves. I do like how dark this is. This is reference that I took, I think, at a botanical garden. See, I just added some black because I wanted this to be darker. I didn't want it to be bluer. I just wanted it to be darker. I do like how dark that is. Here I went a little lighter, desaturated, but I do like how dark that is. If you don't like how dark that is, you can do something different. Also an interesting thing, how I desaturated that is I took the complementary of like red is green, magenta is like a cyan. The primary red is like violet leaning, which is very good for mixing, because if you just mix in a little bit of yellow, you'll get your reds. But I wanted to like dull the green down. So I added some green. Since it is pinkish, it doesn't just automatically go to a brown. It kind of has a little bit of a violet because there is blue in green, and then there's blue in this red. So you can kind of get interesting violets with that. So I kind of dulled it down that way. That's actually nice for me to do that here. For my desaturated colors. Okay. Also, you might be looking at this and be like, why didn't she just use watercolor for this? Why did she use gouache? Gouache doesn't granulate. Gouache does not granulate the same way watercolor does. It might start to kind of do it when, excuse me, when it starts drying up. But gouache does not granulate. So if you want things to be perfectly smooth and have the ability to paint over things, gouache is the thing to do. It's easier to get flat washes as well. Any other questions or activity in the chat? I just felt like I needed some darks, so I added some in. And now I'm kind of in the, I'm making stuff up. I kind of was always in there, but now I'm just fully in that because it's spring and we're doing expressive things. I'm going to add here. Okay. So for all of this, the main thing I'm focusing on is silhouette, because that's what readability will be the first bit, and that's a pretty good rule of thumb for watercolor. Especially, you can kind of go as crazy as you want with colors if your silhouette makes sense in the end. I'm gonna put some white in there to thicken that. Okay. All right. I'm like adding just water to soften edges as well. Next. The way my brain kind of works is I work all over at once. I'm kind of seeing how things will come to be. Here I'm going in opaque again. I'm going in opaque at the tip of this. Do I want to do that? I think I'm going to make, so here I have a choice to either make this petal coming forward or this petal coming forward. And I think I'm going to do that with white, as if there's light on there. Oh, no. Okay. If you will excuse me for a second, I need to go change my water. It's quite dirty now.
while she steps away, I just wanted to remind everyone that towards the end of the class, we'd love to see what you guys are working on. So we'll ask you to change your view and hold up your artwork so we can take a look at it and share it with everyone.
All right. I do want to add in, I think I kind of have to fill in the composition this way, but I'm going to do leaves like I said I was going to do. Kind of making them gray. Also, why am I going to make them gray? This is more of a color theory thing than more than just a gouache thing. If I want how vibrant the flowers are to be stand out, I'll desaturate the other stuff. I'm going to make a kind of a thick mix here and dilute it after. When mixing, there's a lot more complex colors than just your typical, I'll mix red and yellow to make orange. Some oranges have a little blue. And some purples have a little yellow. So many colors have all ratios of all three. Okay. So I know the shape of the leaves are kind of this jagged thing, but do I care that much? I don't know. But I think I will put one here. Maybe here. I think I'm going to make this flat because I'm going to go over it with lighter colors to kind of get that kind of effect. Now I'm like, I think it's too blue. I want to add in some green. One thing I personally like to do is I like to do a lot of mixing on paper. I think you can get really interesting colors that way and keep things vibrant. We're going to go off the paper. All right. Ooh. Sometimes I'm not fully confident about the things I've chosen to do, but painting is improvisational and you're always kind of doing things bouncing off the other things you've done. And that seems rather dark. I don't know how well it's showing up on camera, but there is some color in there. Okay. Now this seems like a shadow, but I think I'm going to paint some stuff over it later. I might use some white to blend into it. Another thing I always try to keep on here is a rag for blotting. I feel like that is apt. All right. A little blue in there. Okay. I think I'm gonna add something yellow or orange. I'm going to kind of go back to that very round shape, but I'm gonna make them smaller because why not? And this, I'm gonna go pretty opaque from the get-go. I'm kind of having all these flowers feel kind of different. And I'm focusing on my silhouette.
Forgive me if this was asked already, but I'm curious about when you painted a section and it's sort of a little wet, do you sort of like change where you're like move throughout the page to dry
Yes.
spots?
Yeah. If I want it to be drier, I'll just, I'll move elsewhere. So it's kind of like when this is back to the planning thing. It's kind of knowing what you kind of want in the end. And so I just dropped in some red. It's still wet because I know that'll keep going. But yeah, I kind of move around. If I'm like, oh, it's too wet, which at the beginning I was kind of doing, like that's why I was going down. I'm like, it's too wet to do what I want to do next. Okay, so I got some brush hairs in this. Let me try to lift those out. I hope it felt pretty like freeing to know that you can break away from reference. And I love reference. I like doing portraits a lot. And if likeness is what you're looking for, reference is good. But for florals, I just like, So another tip when figuring out when things are dry is that you'll see the sheen, and you kind of like move and look at the paper. So that's like the most dry, but then also this you have to like be pretty sure about. If you can't see it, if it's still kind of wet, it'll be like cooler to the touch. Be careful about that. That's like when it's mostly dry. And then you can do certain things with that, but knowing the level of dryness will. So this is going to be 2 flowers here, but I want them to overlap. So I'm doing the bigger shape. I'm also adding light to lighten it, but I still want it to be pretty opaque, which is why I did not do water. And then I'm also going to add in some light. So another thing about gouache is like this is still kind of wet and I'm going in here to get more detail, but it's not like diffusing fully in the way that watercolor might, because pigments are heavy and there's not quite enough water. So this area is rather dry, so I can't really, so that is not blending out as much. I hope you can see that. Yeah, so I'm adding a little bit of water. So like you can see that there is a thickness difference and like how much like the paper you can see then here to here, because I went rather opaque right away. So the whole paper there is covered. So this is mostly dry, but I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna add some stuff to it because why not? Okay, what color is that? I think I'm kind of doing light. Oh, not bright enough for me. We'll be able to see the edges are going to be softer because it's still kind of wet. Come on. At least that edge there. I hope you can see that. So I just painted something lighter over something darker. That's a benefit of gouache that watercolor does not have necessarily. There are a couple pigments that are opaque in watercolor. I believe one of them is chromium oxide green. And then another is one of the blacks. I don't know which one it is. Okay, I'm gonna add some more of these. Any other questions or comments or curiosities? Okay, so here I'm gonna add, I need more. Ooh, my paints are all mixing together because I did not take much care. I kind of am a chaos painter, I will be honest. So I needed some more dark. So this is now thicker than I want. I put too much paint on here. So I'm kind of thinning it out. Okay. I'm gonna clean my palette off. You don't always have to clean your palette off, but I just got pretty messy. All right. Okay. I also am gonna add, oh, let me get back to these yellow ones. I should have added in the red or orange there. I was checking to see how wet it was. So what I'm gonna do is put a light layer over. And yes, gouache will re-wet, but I'm kind of being delicate about it and just adding, like, hovering some water over it. I'm gonna let that sink in a little bit. Another thing, and watercolor does this too, is after a while, it kind of does settle into the paper, and then you can like do your glazing and your layers and you won't disturb it that way. Okay. From time to time, I know it might not look like that. I am still looking at this because for all I'm like, I'm doing whatever I want. I'm like, sometimes I'm like, do I know what a flower looks like? I'm going to look at some flowers and be inspired by that. They're darker here. Okay, so now I need thin and thick. One thing I like to do is paint a little bit thinner, and then I'll drop the thicker paint into it to do the diffusion. And I know this is kind of like layer one, layer two still, and it might be like, oh, this is taking rather a long time, but this is like the bulk of it when you lay everything down. And I didn't draw it because I wanted it to be more organic. But once you have all this down, this is most of everything, because then everything else is gravy. I don't know if you are noticing that I kind of changed the way I hold my brush to make certain marks. We're using a round brush. And round brushes are pretty versatile. But also the control I can get with certain things. will depend on how I hold it. Okay.
Teju, when you're
Yes.
done, do you use fixative or anything on this?
I don't. I don't think I've ever fixed a watercolor or gouache painting ever. I know that some people fix them or like put wax on them. Why don't I fix my paintings? Well, even when they're done, maybe one day I'll want to go back into them. Probably not, but I like knowing that. And also sometimes the fixative can alter the color, or I think wax would probably be safer. But if it's wet or it has some kind of fluid in it, it can do some stuff to it. And I just like the way it looks. I do know in like certain watercolor societies and whatever, it's not like a proper transparent painting if it's fixed. But that's not why I don't do it. I just don't do it because I don't need to do it.
Are there ways you like try to protect your pieces while they're put away or anything?
I just don't have them in the sun. Even if like all these are very good, they have very good light fastness. If I'm using a pigment that doesn't, maybe like alizarin crimson, I also, or opera, I love opera. And it's like basically fluorescent and it'll fade so quick. Then I'll just like keep it out of sunlight. But I don't really do anything extra other than keep them dry. It's like for me, a lot of the work I do to keep my painting safe is in the materials I use. It's like we're using Arches today. Arches is acid-free, archival, cotton paper. The paints are archival and light fast and all that. So that's going to do a lot to protect it. It's like I'm like, if I was afraid of it getting wet, which usually, I mean, where I live, it's not like I'm afraid of flooding. And I don't think I live below the sea level or anything. So I'm not really worried about water damage or humidity. If that answers the question.
May I interject something?
Yes.
This is Susan. I am basically a watercolor artist, and sometimes I do greeting cards for friends and nothing professional. But I found that the Krylon, Krylon, makes a workable fixative. And I've been very successful with it. And it protects pencil, pastel, and chalk drawings. It also can protect your watercolor, and I've sprayed it on acrylic before. So you can go to your art store and see about that, but I've depended on it. Watercolor, Indie ink, crayon, and then if you're painting on wood, metal, plastic, paper mache, glass, paper, wicker, etc. So that's just an idea if you really are concerned.
Interesting.
I'm including a link to Winsor Newton's workable fixative in the chat.
Great, thank you. Yeah, because I'm sure they have a good one also.
I will say, from what I know about fixative, and it might depend on your material that you're using, it might still, like, you might be able to work on top of it. You might not be able to work on, like, change anything underneath. Because depending on what the fixative is made out of, the thing that's going to protect it from humidity or water damage will also protect it from you and your brush. Oh, another thing with like choosing to go in straight with paint versus graphite is if you draw underneath a painting, it's going to seal your drawing underneath, so you won't be able to get rid of it if you draw really dark. I don't really have a problem with that because I don't mind seeing my drawings, but if that's the case, you could use like watercolor pencils, which we have, or just don't draw with the paint. Okay. All right. I am going to add a leaf down here. So it took me a bit of time to do this because I like dropping in color. I like how colorful things can be. So I like to use a lot of color. I mean, we still have the few paints we use, but I like to use a lot of colors in my thing. I feel like it kind of feels like movement in real life. I'm gonna do some, needs a thick mix here. Black to make it darker. And then some red. No. Too dark. Okay. I am going to work on these other flowers now. Blue. So same as with watercolor, layering, I feel like is quite important with gouache. And I try to get things on the first layer rather good, but then it's like your silhouette, some more value stuff, and then detail on top. Okay, so I need like a pure white, and my palette is quite a messy. Actually, for now, and be a little bit more careful. And where is my white? Okay. Thicker. Okay, I'm like painting an edge there. of the thing. I think maybe blue would be interesting in the center. How does that feel? Okay. So I'm kind of adding some petals in the back, I think. Or we'll see if that's what I decide that they are. Petals are kind of interesting because they kind of overlap in certain ways. Because I didn't like that white space there. Trying to get some movement in here. I'm kind of implying that there's like more petals in the center, like the begonias should be like, but we're not being realistic, like per se. We've abstracted what the flowers are like. So it just has to feel like a flower. And I think it does. Okay, I'm drawing some lighter opaque. See how much thicker my paint is here than it was over here because I'm going over. If you've used oils or yeah, I guess oils, you might have heard like fat over lean, thick over thin. Watercolor is the same way. Like thickness of the paint, but also like pigment load. You want more pigment over less pigment. And with gouache, you get more pigment by having the paint be more opaque. This area is still kind of wet, so it's softening that up. And that's too light. Yes.
Well, I'm just giving a check-in on time. We've got a couple minutes till 2:30. So when you get to a good stopping point, I'd love it if we take a pause break and do the gallery view.
Oh, yes. I'll do, okay. I'll do a couple more things. The time passed so lovely. Okay, I'm gonna go over here to kind of show more opaque layering. And then you can stop after this. So that's darker. I'm gonna make a lighter, thicker thing. I'm gonna go over this. And that is one of the joys of gouache. I've added another petal. Okay, I guess we could go to the gallery view now. Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, I love the loose aspect of this where you're going with the flow. Very approachable for someone like me. All right. So if you guys want to see everyone's work with us, you go to your view settings. In my desktop, it's up in my upper right corner. I select gallery, and then you can see everyone. And let's go ahead and share, if you can show on your cameras what you worked on today. Love to see. Anyone?
I cannot see. Let me see.
Awesome.
Oh, I'm in the wrong view, I guess.
These are wonderful.
Oh my goodness.
I love how
Wow.
many different versions there are.
Oh wait, no, wrong camera. This camera.
Wow, they really are.
Oh my goodness.
Sarah, you got your background.
Wow. Ooh.
Beautiful. Thank you, guys. But back, did you have any finishing touches there or any finishing remarks, Teju, for us today?
Well, I mean, there's always finishing. I mean, I have more that I could do, but I mean, I guess after this, I'll show some more finished stuff because sometimes it's hard for me to talk and paint at the same time. But like this one is a little bit more realistic than loose. But like you can see kind of like I went over lighter there, but you can see kind of that washiness. Here's a good example too. And then there's some like looser, you can see kind of how thick the paint can get versus some lighter kind of stuff or like that kind of delicate kind of stuff there. Yeah. I mean, does anyone else have any other questions?
Any last questions for the day?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to tell you I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And I learned
Really?
some
Oh, yay.
interesting
I'm so
technique.
glad.
So thank you so much.
Yes. I'm so glad you came.
Want to plant flowers.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I
And I
wanted
love your
to
art.
say,
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to say it's National Flower Day. So this
It
would be
is?
great. Yes. So this
I
would be
didn't
a
even
great
know.
activity.
I just knew it was the first day of spring. National Flower Day. That's awesome.
It's always Flower Day with me, but it's official.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to see you on our next one. Thank you, Teju and Winsor Newton, for this. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.